Good day to you from Anagalactic. On this 11th day of June, we're heading towards the summer solstice in just 9 or 10 days. That occurs on a cycle, and cycles are notoriously difficult to pin down because they vary. They're not discrete, there's no quantization in a cycle. Now, what you see on the screen over here is Bernardo Kastrup, whom I consider to be an extraordinary thinker. He is a philosopher. He does have a degree in the philosophy of science. And I have spoken extensively about this man in this year of 2026 because I find that his framework for approaching reality has great advantages over the traditional Western scientific view of reality, which is essentially that it is material and physical, external to humans. Just to put this in perspective, why this is significant, first of all, I should tell you what his analytic idealism is promoting. It's basically a reaction to a strict physical separation between the mind and what is external to the mind, which is then considered to be separate. And that is the reality that is outside the mind. I think you would intuit, is indeed the human mind separate from physical reality? They're part of the same concept. It's rather like mechanics and dynamics. You can't have one without the other. This also is reflected in strict physics in the concept of electromagnetism, which is composed of two words, which when you break them down are electroforce and magnetoforce. And it has been proved that one cannot exist without the other. Now, in the case of mind and reality, it's very similar. In other words, it's following the same pattern, that you dissociate two concepts because you're looking at a duality. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I'm looking at his blind spot as I see it. I need a framework for what I call imaginarity, that is, physical imaginarity. There is such a thing in the external universe that can be perceived, indirectly perceived, that is purely imaginary as opposed to perceptual, which is another strange overlap, because if you're talking about something that is imaginary, such as an imaginary physical space, how can you say it's imaginary if you can conceive it? It's relativistic. And the example I would like to bring forward, in order to show that this is that is an application of superpositionality, which does need to be explained in context. That's a very useful term, is superpositionality. It's a term in logic that has been applied to quantum mechanics, as you know, particularly by Paul-Édouard Maurice Dirac, who wrote essentially a book on superposition in physics. So this is a well-known broad-based concept of a layering. That is, superposition means you have a position and something containing it, but they're related. So you can't say that there's a containment. It's similar to electroforce and magnetoforce. They are distinct, but they never occur by themselves, similarly to the construct known as mechanism and dynamism. That what you're doing is explaining something that's essentially both, but you can see that they're separate. So that's somewhat of a contradiction. And the negotiating term for that is superposition. The famous cat problem was posed in order to show that superpositionality in quantum physics is absurd. The superposition in the case of the cat is that if you strictly adhere to the quantum state theory in one of its forms, that is the Bohr formulation of the quantum state, that you have a direct contradiction to a strict form of scientific logic, because at the decision point of whether something happens or not, they're both true. This has led to something called the many worlds. It's very difficult to explain. That it's some tempuscule, that is some indivisible moment as you narrow down to when something occurs, you're trying to make a point. And when you do, you can prove from quantum mechanics that both states exist superpositionally, even if they're contradictory. And in the case of the cat is both alive and dead at the same tempuscule, at the same point in time. That can be proved by a rational reduction, really. It's a form of calculus. You're trying to get a decision point. And so it's a quantization of a process. It's a quantization of a continuity, which is a direct contradiction. It's either continuous or it's made of discrete points. So you're trying to break the continuity, and it appears that we've discovered that happens, which is a direct contradiction. And so the outcome of the quantum revolution, which is really a deep philosophical wrench, that at the quantum state level there is no binary logic any further. In other words, everything changes from something that can be decided to something that it cannot be decided, because the state embodies both substates, which only one can be true. So they're superposed at that tempuscule. I use the word tempuscule in the same way that Newton used corpuscule or corpuscle, which was his term for a particle, which is a quantization of matter. That's atomism. That as you go inward to discover what is the ultimate building block of matter, you come to the same contradiction. That at the smallest scale, you have an overlap between the wave and the particle, which is just disconcerting to the scientific mind. Now, what I have noticed in the blind spot that I believe I've identified in Bernardo's philosophy is that he is unconscious of his position on speciation, which I consider to be fundamental in any scientist's presentation of his philosophy, in this case. That you have to, as a scientist, you have to make a decision about whether or not the human organism, that is what is now called the human species, descended from the ecology. Either it did or it didn't. In other words, are humans part of the ecology by natural descent, as Darwin would put it? This, of course, is by far the prevalent notion. In fact, no other notions are tolerated. And what I always look for in a scientist, whom I admire, and I'm looking at that, I always ask first, is the man an atheist? That is, does he have some rational concept of superconsciousness, which would be called God, which is the superposed reality over our limited reality? Is there a supernaturality? Well, in my view, that's the deciding point between whether a scientist is rational or not. That is, you do believe in God. because it's not a belief, it's something you know. How could a person prove the existence of God? You would have to first define what you mean by God. And in physics, really in logic, the way I approach that subject, with my necessary bias from my past, I always have to remember that I'm involved in this too. So every man has his own prejudices. It's not really, in a sense, his fault. It's a matter of where and how you were born, who programmed you as you were emerging from unconsciousness. This would be your society, your culture, starting with your immediate family. But then as you grow, you're basically helpless. And eventually you reach a threshold, which is generally celebrated in a concept known as bar mitzvah, the turning point in your life, which is another tempescule. It's another turning point where before you were not really responsible for what you think, say, feel, or do, because you're being programmed, and that's really outside of your control. But eventually you have more control. That is, you become conscious, progressively more and more conscious, called the growth process of a human, from birth, infancy, youth. And where do you become culpable? Well, why is there a sense of culpability? Because we're moral creatures. And we perceive that we are responsible for our actions so that we don't take advantage of other human beings in an inhuman way, such as theft or murder. Really, the commandments, the 10 Commandments, deal with that form of culpability, that there are laws of the universe that apply that are not strictly scientific. It's not a question of does the sun rise in the east and set in the west, and how does it do that? Physical propositions that you encounter and rationalize so that you understand your environment. At first, the only understanding of your environment you have, besides your innate onboard perceptual system, you're fed a programming system that you're told what to think. You're told how to regard your environment. And eventually you have to make your own decisions because your programming might be flawed. Now, in the case of Bernardo Kastrup, and my approach to any scientist, including this most admirable scientist, I really like Bernardo a lot, the first thing I ask, because I want to use his system, but then you see I'm tied to him in a way, and I'm sensitive to that, because I don't want to promote a philosophy that's irrational, and neither does he. The question is he consistent? And the first thing I ask in my approach, which is going to be prejudicial, because I'm selecting what to look at. And that's necessary, but it does entail a certain responsibility. I ask if the man believes in a supreme intelligence, what would be called, in the context of evolution, a creative design, which implies directly a creative designer, which is the Lord God Almighty, otherwise called Allah. He has various names, but it's an entity. And it would have to be because we're entities, and either we as entities emerged by some physical process, which he denies, and so do I. There's a superposition where we're derived, and so our concept of ourselves as conscious beings is a derived concept from superconsciousness, and therefore morality as we perceive it is similarly derived. That morality is based on love in the broadest sense, that you consider other humans as being equivalent to yourself. According to the great master, you treat other humans the way you would wish to be treated yourself. Would you want to be robbed or murdered or some other form of predation? Of course not. Humans should not be predators on themselves. We're meant to get along, and that's the basis of, you could just say, love. That when you look at someone else, you see yourself in another human being, such that you draw the conclusion that you, as not wanting to be harmed, would be in that other person too. They don't want to be harmed either. So that is, to me, the basis of rationality on the emotional side, which is somewhat of an overlap. Well, we're overlapping between logic and morality. Now, in the case of biological evolution, it's extremely important to know what is being said, because there are two things that are said. At the inception of what is now known as Darwinism, and Kastrup he's a philosopher, so he calls it by its modern name Neo-Darwinism, and there's no real need to distinguish between the two. It's just that in the development of this theory of biological speciation is the technical term, and that's the word that should be used if you're trying to be objective. It's a theory of speciation, that creatures derive from each other, from simpler forms, such that as you go back in time, you find simpler creatures, because they emerged from a very simple beginning, which then diversified into the millions of species we see today. The real question is, how did the species become separate? And then the key issue is, how does man fit into that sequence? And Darwin faced this, as did all the early evolutionists. When the theory was formulated, it was not just by Darwin, and he was by no means the first man. The reason Darwin came to be, you could say, the poster boy of this theory is because he was such a good scientist, and he based his expression of this new theory on solid evidence, which is really quite simple. In the Galapagos Islands, he found finches, which are distinct species, but they look different, and it's obvious that they're all finches. So his conclusion is that there used to be a superfinch. If you go back in time, there were fewer and fewer finches as separate species, which we now know is a locked code. But is it locked? The evolutionary theory is based on the premise that, of course, it's not locked, and it changes by mutation. And Neo-Darwinism really, as distinct or as having evolved in the concept from just basic Darwinism as expressed in his books, is that Neo-Darwinism is dealing with the mechanism which was discovered in the second half of the 20th century, that it's a code. So a species is identified with that code, and all the codes that we've ever found in the millions of species are locked. That's the definition of a species, is finches cannot interbreed. Now, in the development of the theory right away, it was applied to humans, which is a separate issue because it doesn't look like humans speciated. But that, of course, has been, you would say, successfully challenged in the theoretical model, that, of course, humans have to be descended in the same way that other species are. And so we're traced back through the primates, that we actually were not human at one time. So now you're doing the same calculus, and you're trying you're trying to discern scientifically what happened to produce a new species called the human race. which is one species that is never diversified. It diversifies phenotypically, but that's part of the range in the genotype, as I use these two words. In other words, you find black people, as they're called in Africa, but you find white people in the north, and you find brown people in between. And if you cross the Himalayas, you find more brown people, but they're distinct. They have different facial characteristics. They have different characteristics of the locked code. So when did the code become locked that produced humans? It would have to have been at a specific generation. In other words, there were primates who were producing primates, and those were species. But one of the primate species mutated, and now you're in trouble with your theory, because in order for the human race to emerge at that generation, there would have had to have been more than one mutation simultaneously, because you have to produce a male and a female. And I consider that to be a fatal flaw in the theory, among many fatal flaws. So I do not believe that humans speciate, either in the progressive sense, because we're not speciating, but did we speciate out of the ecology? The prevalent notion in the West is that of course we did, and that's obvious. And Bernardo Kastrup accepts that. And I question that, because that's an irrational, that's an unscientific notion. Not only can that not be proved, it can be easily disproved that humans are not a separate species. We did not emerge from the ecology. That has been proved. And I have at least one commenter who's very curious on that proof. In other words, the person is open-minded, trying to be unprejudiced, as every scientist must be, because you have to prove everything you say. You can't just suddenly regress into a, well, because it's obvious. No. Nothing is just obvious. It has to be explained so that it can be known. In other words, the proof has to be communicable. So what is the proof that I say exists, in actually many proofs, that humans do not speciate? And by that is meant, not only are we not speciating into new species of superhumans, that is not happening, but the main thrust of speciation is going into the past. Did we, in fact, speciate out from prior species? Did humans speciate? No. And I consider that to be extremely important, because, of course, there's a religious aspect to that. Where do humans come from? Could we have speciated out of the bio regime and have become moral? And a lot of philosophers have dealt with this, such as Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the list goes on, where it arose in Europe about the same time as natural selection, which was a 19th century production. It was a new theory, that God does not exist. In other words, it's an atheist theory. And I consider that to be the dividing line, because humans obviously are derived from supermorality. In other words, the reason we know about love, such that we regard each other as worthy of respect, we don't rob other people, we don't hit them to, we don't murder, we don't rob. We treat each other as if we're treating ourselves. And could that have speciated? No. It was derived from superconsciousness, which has, Well, then where do humans come from if they didn't come from the ecology? They had to be created as such. In other words, the first two humans had no predecessors. They were engineered. And that's the story that's in Genesis, the book of Genesis, which is by no means unique account. It's worldwide. That were not so much derived from matter by a physical process of speciation. Rather, we were created ab ovo. That we were created in toto. And that would be the story of the creation of Adam, which I accept. That's rational. That's the only explanation. But it does rely on historical records. Where did humans get that notion? It would have to have been divulged, for instance, to Adam. Well, that can be proved that it was divulged to Adam, that after he was created, he was told by his creator that he was created. And that's the basis of all rational religion. That is, Islam believes that. The major religion on earth for the past 1,000 years has been Islam. Well, that's part of the prophetic transmission. In other words, that's derived from historical records called the prophets, going all the way back to before the flood, which is another touchstone. It's very interesting that the flood was just accepted because that's part of the prophetic transmission, that there was a flood. And part of the problem with the speciation theory is in dealing with this new evidence, which was revealed in the 1980s by Dr. Walter Alvarez, who was able to show that indeed there was a flood, although that's not what he proved. What he proved is that the geological record shows that there was a cataclysm, that the Earth was struck by a bolide from outer space, an asteroid most likely, but it could have been a comet. They're close, they're this similar sized objects. So whatever struck the Earth, it caused the flood and wiped out the entire ecology. That's called Noah's flood. That has been proved. It did happen about 10,000 years ago on that order of time. So that did happen, and it wiped out the entire ecology. The Earth was denuded by that flood. So the current ecology was derived from a new source. And that was the story of the Ark, that there were 8 humans and a selection of animals. It doesn't talk about plants. So the whole thing sounds like a myth. A myth is not necessarily untrue. It's the best explanation that a culture or society can come up with to answer the most important question in science. Where are we from? There is time past. Well, how did we get here? How are humans here? How did we get here? Well, the theory of speciation says is that we're derived from the ecology. But now we have proof that that's impossible because of the flood and the dating of the flood. It is accepted tentatively or really reluctantly by mainstream geologists that, yeah, there were floods. Throughout time, there had been rising and falling of the ocean. This wasn't like that. They're really hedging. They don't accept the evidence of geology that's been revealed in science, that there was a flood. It was about 10,000 years ago, and it wiped out. Wikipedia says that that flood occurred 65 million years ago. That is accepted, that there was a ecocidal flood, but it wasn't complete. In the Wikipedia article on the Chicxulub crater, I know it's Chicxulub if you want to look that up. And in that article, it admits that there was a tremendous cataclysmic flood, but it was 65 million years ago. And that leaves room for evolution. So there was evolution before the flood, which the article says killed 75% of all the land-based creatures. 75% is a huge amount. So there had to be more speciation after the flood to produce the millions of species of plants and animals we find today. What about man? Well, within that range of 65 million years, it's so much time that the mind just kind of goes, it kind of goes like taffy, and oh yeah, that's plenty of time. Well, there has to be a mechanism, and Darwin was very sensitive about that. He said that that was a fatal flaw in his theory, and you can find that in chapter 6 of his first book, a chapter entitled Problems with the Theory. And he really only saw one, but it was fatal, and he said so. So it can be argued from that one, I mean, that's what he wrote, that his theory is absurd in the highest degree, because it can't account for something like the eyeball, meaning the whole vision system cannot have speciated. It's impossible, because it's far too complex to admit of a step-by-step process. A quantization process is what that is. There's separate mutations that coalesce, they correlate. In other words, there was a directed aim in random mutation, which is a contradiction. Either it's random or it's controlled. And if it's controlled, which he says obviously it was, or humans would not have eyeballs that work. And that could not have speciated. And so Darwin actually said that, but he only said it once, because of course he was trying to make money and get fame and, you know, everything that goes with human ego. And that's a little cynical, but you have to figure in the human, and that's what I'm doing with Bernardo Kastrup. How does he regard the theory of human speciation? He accepts it, but in his model that everything is mind, he does admit that there had to be a design in the mind at large, is what he calls it. Well, that's another name for superconsciousness. He says that everything is consciousness. Everything is mind. It's just that we have what he calls detached, kind of a little eddy in the stream of consciousness, which is the universe. And that's a reformulation of physics. Is that the entire universe, if you're going to sum it up, is mental. There's a British use of the word mental, which means that you're mad. And that has to be figured in too, because of the nature of human suffering, the nature of governments, which destroy everything and are destroying the earth. Was that designed? You see, you can't have it both ways. If there is design, then evil was designed as well. What we consider inimical to human existence, including death itself, that was designed. Well, why do we die? So it goes in all philosophical directions, but you see, in Western science, the accepted framework is that mind, the human mind, emerged from matter. In other words, our brain manufactures our mind. Bernardo Kastrup denies that, and so do I, because of course that's ridiculous. Our entire consciousness is part of our body, yes, and you could say it's a localized process in the head, but that's overlooking 99% of what reality is in consciousness, which is very difficult to describe. And the way he attempts to solve that problem, I think brilliantly, is that the universe must be conceived not as a separate physical thing with the mind a product of matter, but rather that the universe is entirely conscious, that it's a conscious entity. But he doesn't subscribe to pantheism. To say that the universe is conscious is pantheism. And that's incorrect, and he denies that he's a pantheist, but it's a very difficult tightrope to walk, and he's fully aware of that. Now, in my further explorations into what is his position on human speciation in the sense of the past to the present, not the future, not future speciation, which is not happening, but was there speciation such that the human is derived from the ecology by the process of speciation? Is that a true model? He accepts it, but it's obvious he doesn't like it. And he goes to extraordinary lengths in this video, which is called, well, I'll give you a link to it if you want. It's easily discovered. He's quite prolific, both in making books and videos. He's an extraordinary man, and I really appreciate his approach. So I'm not trying to pick the man apart, but I actually have to do this, because part of my approach, that is my premise, one of my what I consider to be a rational approach to reality, does not include human speciation. We're not descended from the primates or any other precursor. That we were in fact engineered and created. That a man called Adam was created. In other words, I trust the transmission of the prophecy that originated from before the flood. That can be proved. But it is a human record, and so, of course, it's immediately suspect. And it's completely discounted by Western science. There is no such thing as prophets. It just doesn't make sense in their model. But it has to, because it's part of the human equation. That we do have a past. There was a first man, and then, according to the prophetic record, there was a first woman. And they were both created, they were engineered, not by derivation, but by simple construction, that the man was formed by his own creator. And that has been proved. It's inescapable. It's like, well, how else would you describe the origin of man on Earth? So it's quite a division, and it's leading to quite a conflict. It's always been a delicate issue. But in modern times, you have Western science, which really emerged from Charles Lyell, who introduced the notion of millions of years based on geologic evidence. And from this millions of years, he derived the formation of what we see in geology is based on a process that goes back millions of years. That is tenable. But then along with that came immediately, in the same generation as Charles Lyell, came Darwin and Russell and others who extrapolated that, since there is this huge amount of geological time. In other words, the Earth was not created the way the Genesis record might be said to imply, that the Earth was just created as a body from nothing about 10,000 years ago. And that's called young Earth creationism. That has been thoroughly disproved. That the Bible does not say that. Although if you read the record in Genesis, just really chapter 1, it seems to imply that everything in the solar system was created at the same time. That's not true. It was engineered at the same time. But the rock was here for millions of years. The planets were already here. Although you must say that the the material of the solar system was already here. We know that from stellar evolution, which has been proved. Stars are millions, actually billions of years old. Our sun, that is our solar system, with everything in it, including the planets, has been around for billions of years. The young Earth creationists deny that on the basis of sola scriptura, that the Bible says that that's not the case, and so they deny the evidence of geology. Well, they're wrong. And the young Earth creationists are wrong, because they're Bible thumpers. They've misread that record. So that dispenses with the young Earth creationists. But then there's another group that's more flexible as far as what the record says, that the Earth was here for billions of years, which is true, but the ecology was designed and created within the past 10,000 years, and that is true. So the young Earth creationists are wrong because they deny geological evidence. But the Creation Design Group, Creation Research Institute is probably the main group, they promote the Bible interpretation of how man got here. And they are correct, because the Bible record is true as long as you recognize that it does not say that the solar system was created 10,000 years ago. Rather, the Elohim, that is the visiting team of engineers, the aliens, you could call them, these definitely were aliens, they came from somewhere else, they came here to this solar system and engineered it. And it couldn't have been just the Elohim who are conceived as angels. They were. That's who did the actual work. But it was under the administration of the Lord God Almighty, the creator of the universe, which is billions of years old. And his team came to this solar system and engineered both the solar system itself, which has been engineered. That's on the fourth day when he created the stars. And that's what the young Earth creationists say. He created the solar system. No, that's a misreading of stars. Stars, it refers to the planets because they look like stars in the sky, except they move. They're called astares planetes, and that's in Jude 1:13. That phrase occurs. So it can be proved by strict exegetical analysis of Scripture that the young Earth creationists are wrong because the geology was here for billions of years, but the engineering team that created the ecology did so in 6 days, and that would be 6,000 years. It took them about 6,000 years. And that is summarized in Genesis 1, what they did on each day. And it took 1,000 years a day to do what they did. But man was not created in those 6 days. Man was created on the 7th day, the 7th 1,000-year period. I am a Bible scholar, and I've studied this all my life, and that's my conclusion. That's the meaning of that record. The young Earth creationists misread it. But the creation, the design, it's called design intelligence. That's the name of that framework for that model, which is true. Now, how does Bernardo Kastrup regard that? He's still operating under the delusion that man speciated. And he admits that man speciated, but the way he distances himself from atheism, he's not an atheist. He believes in superconsciousness, which is a very good scientific definition of a designer. Because you would have to have superconsciousness from which is derived reality as we perceive it. It was programmed into us to see. That is, to perceive the way we can use our rational logic system, which was programmed into us by our Creator, to deduce scientifically how we got here. So how does Bernardo Kastrup regard that? Because he doesn't see any way around speciation, that he does accept that, but it's obvious that it irritates him. And so in the videos and the writings that I've been exploring, I've been exploring his work most intently. And now I've found what I believe is his reaction to the young earth creationists and intelligent design creationists. He believes in creationism. He does believe that we're created, but the way we're created is through speciation, which is then controlled. And here is what I want to broach to you so that you have choices. I'm not telling you to I'm not trying to coerce you to some way of thinking, but I am a scientist and I'm trying to present to you the rational approach to this question. As I have analyzed, I've reached my own conclusions, and I would like you to know how I did that. And you now know what I think. I believe in intelligent design by engineering an engineering event that occurred about 10,000 years ago. In other words, it's not hundreds of thousands of years. It's not millions. It's within a called an order of time of 10,000 years. I vacillated about this in stating how long ago did all of this occur. And sometimes I've said that it's within the last 20,000 years. And that's probably the best. But I've also said about 14,000 years, about 12,000 years. I've even gone all the way down to the Archbishop Usher chronology, which is 6,000 years ago. About, well, exactly, according to Archbishop Usher, it was exactly in 4004 BC. I think that's just a little bit angels on a pinhead sort of stuff, but he was a Catholic, and so you would expect angels on a pinhead in order to produce a dogma. So, given the fact that humans emerged with the ecology before the ecocidal flood, you then have to account for the recreation of the new ecology. Did it emerge from the old ecology? According to the prophetic record, Noah, who is highly regarded in Islam as a major prophet, they fully believe in the flood, although they're not sure if it was worldwide and ecocidal. They're just not sure, because that record is passed through the hands of the Israelites, and they don't trust the Israelites in anything they say, because they know that that record has been tampered with by the Levites. That's just to encapsulate a whole bag of worms in how we got this record. How did we receive the book of Genesis? Who wrote it? Well, I know it was Enoch. That can be shown. And he lived before the flood. And he knew Noah, and he also knew Adam. They were contemporaries because they lived hundreds of years. So even though Enoch was the 7th generation after Adam, their lives did overlap. So Enoch got the creation record story from Adam, and he wrote it down. And he gave it to Noah, although whether Noah actually had that book aboard the ark, it was probably memorized. And I don't think there's any way to decide the matter. But once Noah, with his ark, with a number of animal species aboard, they debarked the ark. It's kind of a poetic, or I don't know, an interesting way of saying it. They debarked the ark. Well, those animals speciated. They definitely did. So speciation did occur. But how did it occur? By mutation? That has been disproved. That cannot happen. There's no mechanism for speciation, and yet it occurred. So how did it occur? There's only one answer, and I finally found the answer. It is actually in the book of Enoch, that the Elohim came back. They may never have left. They may have just been hanging around, maybe around Mars or further out, who knows. But the Elohim, the engineers, the angels, under the guidance of the creator of the universe, the Almighty God, Allah, they were there, and they took those animals and speciated them all over the planet. So it was an angelic operation again. But there was no need to recreate man. So man did not need to be speciated. But what happened instead is that man was phenotypically diversified, such that from the ark, it can be shown that the cradle of civilization, the origin of man, is not in Africa. It's on the Ararat Plateau, that is the Iranian Plateau, which extends all the way to the Himalayas. It's part of one solid chain that goes from the Atlas Mountains in Africa all the way across Asia. It goes through Europe, it makes the Alps, it connects with, it kind of curls down through Greece, and then it comes up through the Kafkas, the Caucasus Mountains, goes to the Iranian Plateau, and concludes in the enormous uplift of the Himalayan mountains, which are the highest mountains on Earth, as you know. All of that was a result of the cataclysmic flood. So man spread out with the animals and plants. And the animals and plants were engineered by the Elohim to speciate. They actually guided this process, and that's how we got the millions of species, is by a separate act of, you could say, creation, because it was the creation of new species out of old species. So that explains speciation. It's true for the animals and plants, but it's not millions of years. It took just a few... this is hard to say, but it was within thousands of years. You can measure... all the species were diversified over a period of thousands of years. No more than that. Not tens of thousands of years. Not millions of years. But thousands of years. Now, how does Bernardo Kastrup regard that? he tries to combine them, because he can't deny his own model, but speciation, although he believes that it did occur, but did it occur with man? You see, he doesn't distinguish between the speciation of the animals and plants and the current model, which includes humans as part of that speciation process. Well, the former is true. The animals and plants did speciate, but it was thousands of years, or less, perhaps hundreds of years. We're really not sure. But somehow the angels did it, and we don't know exactly how, but we see the result, and there's no other explanation. Yes, the angels did it, and that is in the record, which was left out of the Tanakh. The Levites left out the book of Enoch, which they surely knew about, or they wouldn't have had Genesis. So why was the rest of Enoch left out? That's a very difficult question to answer. And I have my own opinion on that, but I have to call it an opinion, which is shared by Islam, that you simply cannot trust the Jews with the record. And that's why they don't read the Bible. They don't care about it, because it's been through the hands of the Jews, whom they know ruin everything that they touch. And they're certainly attempting to prove it again, although those are not Jews. There are no Jews left, because they phenotypically diversified when they were kicked out of Israel 2,000 years ago. And there was only one tribe left anyway, so there's no Israel. There's only one tribe left, but they're gone. They went to Europe. They went all over the place. And those people in Israel now are not Jews. They're Europeans. And the Islam people know that. And so do I now. So what does Bernardo Kastrup think about all this, really, in terms of speciation of man? he accepts it. And that's a major flaw. He can't. That's inconsistent. He's wrong. And so I don't like him. I've called him a dog. I've called him the worst possible names that I can. And that's really against my own best interests. No scientist should ever do that. I do it because I'm emotionally committed. And Bernardo Kastrup is kind of a hero figure to me because he's got it all. He's got the right framework. The universe is endowed with consciousness, that we humans have consciousness. Well, where did we get it? Bernardo Kastrup answers that question correctly. We got it from superconsciousness. So, why then is he not Islam? And he's not. And by that I mean that he accepts the record that Christians accept, except obviously they don't get it all right. Well, who does? So I'm trying to get it all right, because that's what science does. We want to know where we came from, not guess, not wishy-washy, kind of this and kind of that. Where did we come from? Well, we were created. Well, how did we survive the flood? The ark. So that's true. And Western science simply, I mean, that's just, to them that is just absurd. No, it's not. No, it's not absurd. It's the only possible answer, and we can prove it. But we do have to use those records. So now we're coming up on an hour. I just wanted to let you know that I do appreciate Bernardo Kastrup's framework, even though he himself is inconsistent, because you cannot believe that humans speciated, and even though he doesn't like it, he does because he doesn't see a way around it. Well, Bernardo, you need Islam. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.